This morning, I started watching a Netflix show, 14 episodes in, halfway watched. I'm guessing my wife has been watching it. And it immediately connected with themes within the psyche. Side note, anything that's incredibly popular in the zeitgeist, in any culture, is touching that culture's feelings in a deep way. Meaning, in order for media, for entertainment to engage, it has to first locate the themes in the audience and then engage with those themes in a way that's more interesting than in everyday life. Because if the romances in cinema were as boring and took as long and were as unrewarding as the romances in everyday life, people wouldn't watch them. Say, oh my gosh, this is worse than my life. I'll just go live my life. No, it's got to do it in a more intense, interesting way. But it's got to deal with the similar themes, worthiness, betrayal, discipline, laziness. The story has to be the same story as the audience is dealing with at some level. But it's got to be faster, more interesting, more polished, more satisfying in some way. Now, that means popular media is effective at least crudely touching those themes. So I immediately began to see the threads, in my own psyche in this Chinese drama. It was subtitled, it's mythological, but all myth deals with core emotional issues. And so there's a connection, a deep connection, a strong connection between the psychological state that I'm in and the media that I'm tuning into. Now, I noticed that I was allowing this in a way that was unusual. I wouldn't normally start watching something halfway through, certainly not 14 episodes in that I didn't know much about. In that sense, I arrived at the material intuitively, out of order, out of lineal sequence, and yet it had strong resonance, strong relatability to what was relevant to me as a psyche, as a self, dealing with these same energies in my own life. Now, this is exploring the continuum of order and chaos, meaning an orderly way to do things would be to say, well, what kind of media should one like? Or how should one pick media? Well, one should figure out what one likes, or one should figure out what's useful. So there's a path of that. And then you say, okay, well, this is the one I like the most. You sample it, and then you watch it in order, right? And then you get a result, right? But you could also enter media randomly and say, what's here? Or you could sample and go around intuitively. You could watch 2/3 of one movie, jump to the beginning of another movie, and that's it, right? And do it somewhat intuitively. And if you think about what matters, relatability is the core, value. I mean, if it has nothing to do with you, if you can't relate to it, it will have no meaning. If it's meaningless, it has no value. It has to have meaning, which means it has to relate to your values. But it doesn't have to be done in order. You don't have to finish a movie. You don't have to watch the beginning. You don't have to read one series at a time. You can read 3 books at a time. You can jump from the back to the front. And the question that I'm exploring is whether or not a more open minded framework for exploring media is more beneficial, or when is it more beneficial than, the orderly approach? Well, I'm just noticing today that chaos is hitting the spot more than order. Now, another echo of that theme later this afternoon came in a work that I'm doing that I'm calling Inner Dialogue, and I'm using an email format with bullets. Now, here again, what's going on inside is I'm noticing feelings. I have memories, and then certain emotional states come up, and I say, I wonder why that emotional state is triggered by that memory. I had a memory of a client walking around their house, and they'd said, don't walk around the house without knocking on the door. And I had a very distinct emotional response to that. The memory came up, the emotional response came up. I haven't seen that client in years. So the emotion and the memory is out of sync with time. Now, I think, okay, this could be a great candidate for my daily routine of doing something with Inner Dialogue. So I head over, open the email, and I write the statement of what I feel. And I start to see who can and is willing to respond to that voice. It's called the dialogue, right? Who shows up to respond, and what do they say? Of those that show up to respond, the first voice, which is there a voice that it's friendly to? Well, this takes me quickly into imagination, into imaginal territory, because it's hard to rationally build a basis for that feeling. Now, I'm sure if I had access to all my childhood memories, I would understand the primary trigger in the moment when it came into being in this lifetime. But that's not necessary in order to understand the context, as I'm discovering. Because as I start shifting the inner dialogue and noticing the pictures that show up, suddenly I'm in Scotland. Why? Suddenly I'm a drunk. Why? I've never been drunk. I certainly haven't been a Scottish old man who's drunk. But that's the character that's having these feelings. And then there's characters that show up to respond, which in a certain logic would be, for example, a Scottish woman shows up to respond to the drunk Scottish man that's feeling and saying the things that are in my body. And goes back and forth, and it resolves. It resolves. The old Scottish drunk is grieving the parting with his son. His son died in the fishing business. He was on bad terms with his son. He's grieving. He couldn't digest all the emotions with his son, and then his son is dead before he has a chance to resolve and digest that inner dialogue around his son. And so he's drinking to spend time with that and also to numb the grief of uncried tears and unspoken words. And how does it resolve? Right? So how does that resolve? Well, a kind Scottish woman takes him in, and they become lovers, and they become partners, and they share the feelings together, and they are digested, and there's a sense of peace, there's a sense of well-being. Now, that's me watching that process going on. In other words, I'm giving permission for non-local, non-rational images to drive the narrative. Meaning, if I'm impose rationality, I say, hold on, I'm not 68. I don't have a beard. I don't have a Scottish accent. That's not me, right? That's the rational imposition, right? But if I allow the images to emerge that best reflect the feeling that's in my body, and then if I allow other images to emerge and relate and learn what works with the first set of images that are in my body changes. Meaning I feel the pleasure in my body of that Scottish man developing a new love and digesting the grief of his son. And my body is now free as a result of that dialogue. In a similar way that I understood and empathized with the dialogue in the Chinese movie early on today that had nothing to do in time and space, but had everything to do with similar emotions. And so the technique and the paradigm that I'm exploring here is the value of the entire continuum of order and chaos, rationality and irrationality. Order and chaos would have precluded both of those experiences. Yet they were meaningful, they were valuable experiences that facilitated growth, well-being, integration in my day, in my body. I'll leave it with you to explore the territory further, and thank you for watching.